Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the Hunter and Nandini and Adira for having me. And we actually talked about having me come here, what was it, 2.5 years ago? So it's taken a while to put it together. So I'm absolutely thrilled to finally be here and talk to you guys. So this is a quote that kind of informs my artistic practice. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I absolutely love his choice of words. It describes a sentiment that thousands of quotes have been devoted to. My artistic practice it's become steeped in history, and it involves writing about topics, in-depth research, capturing images that convey a sense of emotion, all with the ultimate goal to spark conversations and open up a dialogue on various difficult topics. It is very important to me to try to understand why things are the way they are in today's society. What are they a result of? How deep does this particular history go? These are topics that I explore regularly, especially as I write. And I try to write 3 pages a day. So this is kind of one of the notebooks that I fill up as I go. Oftentimes, ideas for projects show up on the page. And I like to think of the projects as choosing me to deliver them into the world. And so that's kind of how I work. So I'm going to share images from several different projects with you. And when I sent the slides, Adira was like, oh my gosh, how are you going to get that in the amount of time? So I'll click through stuff quickly, but we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if anybody has any questions, I can answer them at that time. So as mentioned, this is the series that I just finished. I worked on it from 2016 to 2020. The roots of the women's movement is rooted in the anti-slavery movement, so that's how I got interested in the women's movement. And in 2016, when I was visiting my family, my mom and stepdad still live in Indianapolis, Indiana. I went to the Indiana Historical Society, and they have a fabulous research library, and that was actually very integral to the research that I did for the Underground Railroad project. This kind of glitched out in translation from Mac to PC, so I apologize, but in the background are these letters that are from the League of Women Voters of Indiana, which became the Women's Franchise League and ultimately the League of Women Voters once women were allowed to vote. But I was digging through this paperwork, and at the time in 1916, 1917 timeframe, they were trying to get a special section of the Indiana Congress in order to pass a state referendum to allow women the right to vote. And they were sending out these, I guess, pledge cards to the various influential men around the state, asking them to pledge their support. And so the men would send back these letters. And in this letter, this is from Samuel M. Ralston, who was running to be governor of Indiana. And in the top right corner, this is a quote directly pulled from his letter with his signature scrawled beautifully at the bottom. It says, "I would not be entirely frank with you if I did not say that in my opinion, the activity of women in planning and conducting political campaigns would not add to the harmony and love that is obtained in the home." In other words, stay home. So, but I read several letters like that, and I was like, wow, these stereotypes are still here with us. And so I really wanted to explore the process. So I began looking into the women's rights movement and learning about it, because when I went to school, the extent of what I learned was there are so many amendments to the United States Constitution, and 19 was one of them, and that was it. No more details than that. So I taught myself like tons of history and learning. And but it was a huge, long movement that lasted 100 years. And so how could I personalize this movement that encompassed thousands of women from all different walks of life? So I stumbled on this banner that you see up here: forward out of darkness, leave behind the night, forward out of error, forward into light. Well, my previous body of work on the Underground Railroad was called Through Darkness to Light. So when I saw this banner, I was like, well, the universe is trying to tell me something. So I figured out who carried this banner. And it was Inez Milholland Boissevain. And she was basically a little known figure now, but she was at the forefront of the movement at the turn of the century. She was born in 1886 and she died in 1916. And she actually carried this banner in a New York City parade in 1910. But as I began to research her life, I absolutely fell in love with her. I became enamored with her. She was driven by her belief that women were equal to men, which was unheard of at that time period. She became a lawyer, an activist, a war correspondent, a suffragist, and an orator. And she was talented at all of the above. She wrote speeches, letters, plays, articles arguing that women were worthy of the right to vote. And as I read her words, often in her own handwriting, which took two of us 5 months to decipher because she should have been a doctor. I could almost hear her voice in my head enumerating the ways in which women were competent, capable, intelligent, and active contributors to modern society. She thoughtfully and methodically would counter each argument that men would put at her. And sometimes I felt if the dates were removed off of her letters, they could have been written today. It was very disconcerting, like all of the things that they were dealing with back then. So from labor laws and prison reform to war and women's rights, she fought tirelessly to dispel the stereotypes about women she kept butting up against. And each rejection only fueled her determination more. She was turned away by 3 Ivy League law schools and denied access to the front lines as a war correspondent because of her gender. She graduated with a law degree from New York University in 1912, and she later practiced law in a male-dominated profession. In this photo, this is Inez, and she is at the 1913 National Women's Suffrage Association parade in Washington, D.C. The parade got violent quickly. Women were pulled off floats, they were beaten, they were spit on, their signs were shredded. She rode Gray Dawn at the front of that parade and got the women to safety because there was a question whether or not they would make it. Inez, in 1916, in the summer, helped form the National Women's Party. And that was formed out of there were a bunch of suffrage groups that were definitely divided up, and a lot of the process of dividing those groups up was in relation to race, because the white women felt that the white women should vote, but not the black women. And again, you have racial ties and discussions in this movement as well as in the Underground Railroad. But so they helped, the goal of the National Women's Party was to go for a national amendment because they knew that the state-by-state route wasn't gonna happen for every state. Obviously, the southern states were not for women to vote. They did not want it. So she helped form the party, and then they got frustrated by the lack of progress in the state-by-state method, which I mentioned, and they were tired of President Woodrow Wilson's inaction on the matter. He was pretty much adamantly against it, but he wouldn't come out and publicly say that. So they hatched this plan to send dozens of suffragists from the East out to the West Coast, to the western states where women had the right to vote. So that was Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. And they were asking all of the women to file a protest vote and to vote against Wilson and his fellow Democratic incumbents and everybody. And they didn't think that it would actually change the outcome of the election, but they wanted to say, okay, you're not gonna win in a state where women have the right to vote. So they basically were trying to force him to acknowledge this block of Western women voters and support their sisters back in the East by having him have to support the national amendment. And Inez was chosen for this campaign as a special flying envoy. So she was like the main speaker that would go out along this, this trip. So as I mentioned, my process is extremely research-based. So that's one of her handwritten letters on the left up there that you see. So you can see her handwriting is quite difficult to read. And on the right is the suffragist magazine that was part of the National Women's Party. So they were covering her tour. And she traveled in October of 1916. She and her sister Vida traveled with her. They departed from New York City on October 4th, and they stopped in Chicago. And they embarked on a grueling campaign traversing 8 states in 21 days, only a portion of the 12 states that they were meant to cover. Inez delivered some 50 speeches while battling chronic illness and lack of sleep. Her 3-week itinerary, brutal even by today's travel standards, consisted of street meetings, luncheons, railroad station rallies, press interviews, teas, auto parades, dinner receptions, speeches in the West's grandest theaters, and even impromptu talks on the train while on the way to her next destination. Basically, Alice Paul, who ran the National Women's Party, had her itinerary where she was traveling all night long and giving speeches all day. The woman never slept. They predict that they knew she had pernicious anemia, but I guess some scholars think that she might have had leukemia and they wouldn't have known what that was back then. So she actually had, so let's see, I'm kind of jumping ahead because I'm going off my brain instead of looking at my notes. But so the images in this series actually follow this campaign trail that I was able to piece together from her letters, from local newspaper coverage, from the Suffragist magazine, from National Women's Party papers, and everything. And so this is actually a 1916 railroad map that I found on eBay, and I photographed, and I purposely, and then I printed it out, and I purposely cut it in half, and then I stitched it back together because the East Coast is asking for the West Coast help, and then I hand embroidered their route into the map. So I purposely asked women of all ages and backgrounds to stand in for Inez because ultimately the suffragists gained the vote for all women. Although a lot of women were not able to vote until 1962, Utah was the last state to allow Native American women to vote, and then Black women did not vote until 1965 for the most part. On the left is Ballot Box circa 1910. On the right is Ready for Battle, and that image was taken in 2019. On the left, New York Times article saying Mrs. Boycephon is off today. And on the right is Farewell, Grand Central Terminal, New York, New York. And that's supposed to be Inez saying goodbye to her husband, Eugen. So Inez and her sister Vida, traveling via train, left New York City on October 4th, 1916, stopping first in Chicago to meet Alice Paul at National Women's Party headquarters. In a letter to her husband, Inez wrote, "A horrible journey to Chicago was had, and I was sickest every bit of the way." She attributed her pain in head, shoulders, and back, coupled with dizzy headaches, to the train, writing that she would get used to it after a bit. She saw reporters in the afternoon and then saw the first of many doctors during the trip who said that her tonsils were in awful shape. So she had tonsillitis so severe that they wanted to take her tonsils out immediately, but she was determined not to fail, so she continued. And she also had strep throat, and she had the pernicious anemia. The night before the campaign began, the Milholland sisters had dinner and drinks with their father, John Milholland. He would later write in his diary that he was already concerned for Inez's health before she left. She had bruises all over her body already. So whatever illness that she had was taking hold. This is in transit Idaho. Oh wait, this is actually Arrival, I'm sorry. And this is Chicago. This is In Transit in Idaho. And I used various train museums around the country. This was actually taken here in Chattanooga at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Train Museum. On the left, suffrage dress. In the margin of one of her letters to Eugene, she mentioned that her attire was just right. And that's kind of where the white suffrage dress came from, was from these campaigns where they were trying to do women's votes. On the right is a gift of flowers, train platform, Glens Ferry, Idaho. Admirers greeted her at various stops along the way with flowers and fruit baskets. Snake River near Twin Falls, Idaho. Penny Theater, Boise, Idaho. Blue Gem, Washington. We Will Not Fall Down. Fever, Aches, and Pains. In a letter to her husband, Eugene, dated October 8th, 1916, Inez mentions that doctors have prescribed her a combination of arsenic and strychnine and iron, and she thought it was helping her. Modern medicine back then, they didn't know what they were doing, so they were poisoning her, basically. On the left is Arsenic and Strychnine, the Sunset Club, Seattle, Washington. I was really frightened when I was able to buy this bottle of pills of actually chocolate-covered arsenic and strychnine off of eBay that was original, but I wanted to photograph it, and then I was like, what do I do with it afterwards? But she basically, on the right, is called Marching Onward, Washington. She would continue to take these pills throughout the tour, sometimes doubling and tripling the doses just to make it through the day. She was determined not to quit, and several other women had already done so, including Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. This is Women Hold Up Half of the Sky. Whistle Stop Speech, Cut Bank, Montana. And she wrote in another letter to Eugene, I found a great crowd at the station. I couldn't think why until I heard someone say, there she is. Then I suspected. My heart sank, I don't mind telling you. Then the brakeman and porter said, they are looking for you, so I went to the back of the train and made a speech fairly good. So they traveled to Cut Bank and Shelby and on. So now we are in Montana, leaving Helena, Montana. A storm is building, Ogden, Utah. Telegram from Eugene. The correspondence between Eugene back and forth and the letters are what kept her going. Dawn, and this is the Sierra Nevada mountains. I actually took an overnight train so that I could see what it was like to ride on a train and photograph from it. In a report back to Alice Paul, Vita had said that the mountains turned a perfect suffrage purple, and they actually do, so I photographed it. This is called Lifeline, and Inez actually died at the end of this campaign, and so that's one of the reasons that this image is here. But it's also, I think if you focus in on the wedding band, that was a crucial part of what she was doing, because when she married her husband, Eugene, in like this whirlwind courtship where she proposed to him, because he was a citizen of a foreign country, there was an American law at the time that any woman who was American that married a foreign husband, she was required to give up her American citizenship and become a citizen of her husband's country. So Inez is going on this campaign, ultimately killing herself to win the right to vote that she is never going to be able to participate in. So that made me like her even more. Eugene actually said that he would go ahead and nationalize so that she could vote if and when it ever passed. And she said, no, we're going to get the law changed, but it actually didn't change until the Cable Act in 1922. This is preparing for a speech, the Palace Hotel, San Francisco, California. Oakland Tribune, California. This is from October 22nd, 1916. Brilliant suffrage leader holds Wilson to answer. Back to the city, leaving Phoebe Hearst's estate, Pleasanton, California. Phoebe Hearst was the daughter of Hearst Media Empire. She was a huge suffragist. Fading rose, and on the right, faints at her highest point. So Inez arrived in Los Angeles on October 23rd. She delivered her last speech to about 1,000 people at Blanchard Hall, where she collapsed on stage while speaking. She returned 15 minutes later to finish her speech from a chair. Her final public words were, "President Wilson, how long must this go on? No liberty." Although she tried to be indefatigable, that's a really hard word to pronounce, according to the Los Angeles Daily Times, Inez's rapidly deteriorating health forced her to stop campaigning, and she died only 1 month later, on November 25th, 1916, at the age of 30, one of the martyrs of the suffrage movement. There's a project website if you're interested, standingtogetherproject.com. If there are any educators in here, there's a ton of resources on there for educators. And then there is a book if you're interested. It's MW Editions is the publisher, and it just came out this year. And then I'm trying to get together a traveling exhibition for the work as well. So this is from the gallery in Dallas. And so I'm going to move on to Through Darkness to Light, photographs along the Underground Railroad. So this is a project that I worked on from 2002 to 2016. It was 14 years in the making. The majority of that time was spent on research, trying to find a documented route that I could piece together to actually have somebody move through this. I guess it's meant to be one person's view. And I did that on purpose because I felt like if I focused on just one station, that wasn't fair to the people that were escaping to freedom, because the station barely helped them. It was them that did all of the work. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. Basically, the Underground Railroad was America's first civil rights movement. It blurred racial, gender, religious, and socioeconomic lines and united a wide range of people in the common cause of ending the injustice of slavery. And this is kind of just a brief look into the research. So I have a massive library of books. I have maps. The research said that freedom seekers moved roughly 20 miles per night, and that kind of was the framework that I photographed in, roughly every 20 miles from Natchitoches, Louisiana, all the way up to Canada. But I tried to use primary sources from the time period, as well as I was researching this, more and more research was coming out, because Freedom Trail initiatives from Congress. So this is kind of the route that I put together. Is it a route that somebody actually took? I don't know, but it's very possible, and it could have been. And I know that some of the stations actually worked together and passed people along on the route. This is Decision to Leave Magnolia Plantation on the Cane River, Louisiana. Southern Pine Forest following El Camino Real, LaSalle Parish, Louisiana. Stopover, Frogmore Plantation, Concordia Parish, Louisiana. Sunken Trace is on the left, Claiborne County, Mississippi. On the right, Determining True North in the Rain, along the southern part of the Old Natchez Trace, Mississippi. Keep Going, Crossing the Tennessee River, Colbert County, Alabama. And this is one of the images that is upstairs, if you get a chance to go up there. I have a quote from Frederick Douglass where he said, "A keen observer might have detected in our repeated singing of O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan, something more than the hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan." Devil's Backbone, Lewis County, Tennessee. The man I called master was my half-brother. My mother was a better woman than his, and I was the smartest boy of the two. But while he had a right smart chance at school, I was whipped if I asked the name of the letters that spelled the name of the God that made us both of one blood. William, slave and half-brother to a United States Senator. Fleeing the Turkey, Harriet Tubman wrote, I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as long as strength lasted, and when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me. Over the hills, North Trimble County, Kentucky, you're literally looking at the dividing line between the North and the South. You're standing in the border state of Kentucky, which is identified with the South, and those blue mountains that you're looking at in the distance are Indiana, which is the first free state across the Ohio River. This is Eagle Hollow from Hunter's Bottom, just across the Ohio River in Indiana. And Eagle Hollow was part of a network of stations that shepherded freedom seekers north through I guess it's kind of the eastern route through Indiana. And Chapman Harris, who was a free black reverend and blacksmith, signaled safe crossing to fugitives waiting on the Kentucky shore of the Ohio River with hammer strokes on his anvil. On the left is Nightlight, passing into Fayette County, Indiana. On the right, Friend or Foe, stationed just outside of Metamora, Indiana. A brief respite, abolitionist William Beard's house in Union County, Indiana. I kept coming across this research as I was going through the library about the Henry County Female Anti-Slavery Society, but Henry County wasn't on my route, so I kept ignoring it, but it kept coming up, and I kept ignoring it, and it kept coming up. So I finally pulled out the minutes book and looked at it, and it's an 1800 minutes book with this beautiful script written in it. And I was reading through the minutes, and members of this society were taking up donations to buy 127 yards of free labor cotton, that means cotton that's not sourced from plantation work, in order to sew garments, vests, coats, pants, dresses, shirts, and socks. 2/3 of the garments were directed to Salem, Union County, care of William Beard, who owned this house. And coincidentally enough, as I was putting together the route, I couldn't find this house, the address for it. And it was getting very frustrating because I was like, I had a section and I couldn't connect them. So I actually ran into, when this body of work was up at a show, the woman next to me, her uncle came to the show who was a lawyer, and he looked at the work and we started talking about it. He said, oh, that's interesting. My ancestors were on the Underground Railroad. He's William Beard's descendant. So he was able to give me the address of the house, which is lots of things like that happened while I was working on this project. On the left is a safe place to regroup. House of Levi Coffin, who is unofficially dubbed the president of the Underground Railroad in Fountain City, formerly Newport, Indiana. And he had written, the dictates of humanity came in opposition to the law of the land, and we ignored the law. On the right is Approaching the Seminary near Spartanburg, Indiana. And it was part of the Union Literary Institute, and part of their Constitution, Article 8 states that their differences in government, discipline, and privileges will not be made with regard to color, rank, or wealth. So they were educating blacks at this time when it was against the law, and they continued to do so. On the safest route, James and Rachel Sullivan Cabin, Pennville, formerly Camden, Indiana, and several documents from the mid-1800s to the present point to the fact that maybe Eliza Harris stayed at this location, and she is best known for her crossing of the Ohio River in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Within reach, crossing the St. Clair River to Canada, just south of Port Huron, Michigan. And Freedom, Canadian soil, Sarnia, Ontario. And Harriet Tubman said, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now I was free. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. And again, this is the book that was produced for the work, and they have copies downstairs for sale if you're interested. And then there is a project website as well with tons of information if you're an educator again. And a lot of the primary sources are on there as well if you're interested in going and looking at them too. And then this is, I guess, a project that I worked on that's another traveling exhibition with another photographer. He photographed the offensive side of the Cold War, and I photographed the defensive side of the Cold War. So he did missile silos, and I did fallout shelters and civil defense materials. And then this is another project that is currently in progress, and I started it in 2015 when I was an artist in residence in the Everglades. And so what I did is researched the Florida Maroon communities. So this is pre-Underground Railroad, totally separate history. So they, I guess enslaved people would escape down into Florida and form communities. And it was usually in relation to the indigenous communities, and they had a very symbiotic relationship. And the project is actually named after the Congo signs of the cosmos and the continuity of human life that you see in this Congo cross. And so those little discs are considered the 4 moments of the sun. And so the living world is the top part and mirrored in the underworld below. And then they believe in reincarnation and that people come back and that they never die. And so I just felt like that kind of embodied these communities that were thriving until Andrew Jackson came through as part of Manifest Destiny and systematically wiped out all of the communities and forced them further and further south. And that's what's indicated on the map there. This was one of the communities that was along the Suwannee River. In, I guess, what's now Old Town, Florida, and it's on a gentleman's private property. And he just so happened to have a friend over with a metal detector, and the metal detector went crazy, and they found all of these things in the ground, and they figured out that it was Bowlegs Town. And there were 50 miles of community of free blacks along the Suwannee River for generations before Andrew Jackson came in and wiped it out. This is a turn in the path, Fort Mose, St. Augustine, Florida. And this was established in 1738, and it was sanctioned by the Spanish government, making it the first free African settlement to legally exist in what now is the United States. The settlement gave sanctuary to Africans challenging enslavement in the English colonies of Carolina. Approximately 100 Africans lived at Fort Mose, forming more than 20 households. Together, they created a community which drew on a range of African backgrounds blended with Spanish, Native American, and English cultural traditions. The colony remained until 1763 when Florida was ceded to England. To be upside down, Negro Fort along the Apalachicola River, Prospect Bluff Community, Florida. In the early 1800s, Spain was losing its hold on Florida, and Britain took advantage by establishing a stronghold called British Fort on the Apalachicola River. Here, by offering land and freedom in the British West Indies for service, they recruited more enslaved from Louisiana, Mobile, Pensacola, Georgia, and the Lower Creek Nation. The British trained and armed about 3,000 Native Americans and 300 black soldiers to protect the fort, which safeguarded families, fields, and pastures extending 50 miles along the Apalachicola River. The post earned a reputation as a threat to supply vessels that traveled to the United States, so it was ordered to be destroyed in 1816. Alerted to the impending attack, black families and Native Americans, women and children took refuge in the fort. But early in the battle, a heated shot landed in the magazine of the fort, and it was blown to pieces, and there were only 33 survivors. If trees could talk, Bowlegs Town and Negro towns along the Suwannee River, Florida. Maroons start to settle in various communities around Florida along sources of water like rivers and springs, and like I said, some of them were there for generations. Fleeting Seconds of Liberty, Bowlegs Town. In the War of 1812, African Americans were called on to help fight the Spanish. The East Florida Patriots occupied a deserted site during the ill-fated attempt to overthrow Spanish rule. A local garrison, aided by the Negro militia and Native Americans, forced them to withdraw. A scarred land, Bowlegs Town. From 1812 to 1818, Seminole Chief Bowlegs established a town surrounded by Maroon communities near what is now Old Town, Florida. During the Battle of Sewanee in 1818, the Maroons held off Andrew Jackson's United States troops, allowing others to escape further south. Abandoned homes in the community were destroyed. Survivors fled to a community along the Manatee River called Angola, and its importance as a refuge grew, making it even more of a threat to the United States. The Crossroads, Bowlegs Town. Cross River, Bowlegs Town. The pace of bloodshed and destruction increased after 1860s. Settlers were killed, plantations raided, livestock, free blacks, and formerly enslaved seized. Survivors of these attacks were driven south deeper into the Florida frontier. Grandfather's Beard, Bowlegs Town. The battle for Florida continued, with Jackson's forces attacking successive settlements and continuing into the Second and even Third Seminole Wars. African Americans and their Maroon communities were essentially written out of this part of American history. Dawning of a New Day, Angola community in Florida. As survivors continued to flee south, many arrived in Angola along the Manatee River. At its height, historians estimate its population in the hundreds, some as high as 700 or more, making it a significant threat to slavery. In 1821, Angola and the other Gulf Coast Maroon communities were burned to the ground, and that's pulled from actual documents. Rooted in the land, Charlotte Harbor community, Florida. African and Native alliances allowed the two groups to live side by side. Both Native and African cultures valued family above economic profit and had a relationship to the land. Transition, Charlotte Harbor community, Florida. In 1818, Andrew Jackson led a force down the Apalachicola River to destroy Black, Seminole, and allied Upper Creek villages in what was to become known historically as the First Seminole War. A Forked Branch, Florida. Passageway, Menotti community of the headwaters of the Peace River in Florida. I had the chance to speak with one of the descendants, and so they're hoping to try to get some markers made for some of these sites around the state. Circle of Souls, Everglades, Florida. Mirrored Worlds, Big Cypress Swamp. Dividing Lines, Everglades, Florida. As the raids continued and terror reigned all over Florida, blacks disappeared into the swamps of South Florida. The Boundary, Everglades. Dividing Lines 2. Protective Grace. And Everlasting Pool, Cape, Florida. Some made it through the Sea of Never-Ending Grass, which is a nickname for the Everglades, and arrived at what is now known as Key Biscayne, an island off the coast of Miami. There they were taken by British shipping vessels and Native American canoes to the Bahamas, where some of the descendants still live today. This was part of a display at the Everglades National Park Airy Nest Gallery in 2020 that, like the Southbound exhibition, got shut down early. But we had timelines and books and maps and everything for people to read. And then we did a whole panel discussion, which was my last traveling trip before the country shut down. And then we took a hike on the Everglades Trail afterwards. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
After you've done the research for a particular project and you're going on site, do you have in mind before you go what photographs you want, or do you see them after you get there?
Both, definitely both. So for instance, for the Underground Railroad, like I knew I was going to locations and some of them were obvious. It's like, okay, I want to take a picture of the station house. But some, like the things that were in between that had no structures, I actually had to be on the ground. So I would literally, initially I was going out about 2 weeks at a time, and I would scope out sites during the day, and then I would stay up all night and photograph. And I quickly figured out that that wasn't going to work for my health. So I stopped doing that. But yeah, when I was photographing in Indiana and Michigan, I had my mom or my stepdad or my sister with me to help. And I was trying to figure out how I could go about in the South safely. So I actually started hiring off-duty police officers to accompany me. And that actually was very helpful because they knew the lay of the land and they could suggest different places to go that might work. And one of them, I think I hired him 3 or 4 times near Natchez, Mississippi. And I actually got caught for speeding, and so he got me out of the ticket, so that was one bonus. But then he was able to get me into like a bunch of restricted areas. But we had, obviously, we're out for like hours at a time, so we had some time to talk, and I kept mentioning that one of the signs that I would know that I should be photographing a certain location was because there would be a cardinal bird there, to the point where he would comment, "There's a cardinal there," and I'm like, "Yep, I'm supposed to photograph here." So, and I had also that same trip, I would, like I said, scope out places during the day and then go back with him at night, because he was willing to go pretty far. So we went into Louisiana, and then we went all the way up almost into Tennessee along the Natchez Trace. But one of the places along the Mississippi, I was like, it's safe enough for me to go. So I'm just gonna, we got back, and it was like 3:30 in the morning, and I said, I'm just gonna go lay down for a little bit because I was so tired. And so I set my alarm, and then I got up to go to the bathroom a little bit later, and I'm like, I'm not gonna get up, I'm too tired. And so I turned my alarm off, and then a little bit later, all of a sudden the TV turned on in the hotel room, and I was like, what's happening? Like, what? And so I figured out that the TV turned on. So I got up and I turned it off, and then I was like, I'm still too tired, and I went back to bed. 15 minutes later, the TV turned back on again. I got up and I was like, all right, I'll go photograph. And sure enough, I got some really great images that I used for the series. So, but yeah, that's why I kind of feel like the projects sometimes choose me more than I choose them, because I have a lot of experiences like that with the birds, or when I can't find a location, it just so happens that I have the ancestor right there to tell me where the address is. Or we were in Madison, Indiana, which was they had a huge section called Georgetown that was a free Black community, and George DeBaptiste was one of the station masters there. He actually had to relocate to Detroit, Michigan, because it was too close to Kentucky and his life was being threatened all the time. But so I'm photographing, it's like 1:30 in the morning, these old, beautiful, like row houses, 1800s. And this woman comes out of her house walking her dog at 1:30 in the morning. And so it's a long exposure, and my mom's with me. I'm like, Mom, can you go tell her that she's in the shot and she needs to move? And so she went, and she's like, well, what are you doing? So my mom was explaining to her, and she's like, oh, that's so weird. So she was actually on the committee to put up like an Underground Railroad monument for the area. And she had been working with a bunch of local scholars and was able to give me their names, and I was able to coordinate with them to get even more research so it's like, had she not decided to walk her dog at 1:30 in the morning while I was there, then I might not have stumbled across that research, so.
Thank you. What format are you working with?
I have a my background is in 4x5 sheet film. So I wanted these to be able to be blown up really big and be crystal clear, tack sharp from front to back. And I'm using a Canon digital system with the tilt shift lenses that do the movements that mimic the 4x5. And for those of you that don't know, think of like a smaller version of Ansel Adams' camera with the bellows. And the reason that you have that is so that, like, if you take a picture of like a skyscraper, the lines converge, but you can do movements with the camera or the lenses that make those those lines stay parallel, which is why I chose that system. But if you're shooting digitally in low-level light situations, you have noise. And so it was like some of the first photographs that I took, they were completely unusable.
That's actually why I asked.
Yeah,
It just kind of went back to
I went,
film and what that process
no, I
was.
stayed digital because with the rest of getting into technicalities with reciprocity failure and all of that stuff, like I used the reciprocity failure charts for mapping out my times for the digital camera. But like literally I would have to, for some of the images, like I went back to photograph a barn and it was this beautiful wooden barn and they put vinyl siding on it. And so I was like, oh, I can't photograph it now. So I had to go back and use the pictures that I had, and I tried stacking. So like, say noise are these, it's like these weird pixels that show up, like you have a red dot and a blue dot and a green dot and all in around, and it looks like these weird dusty things in the photograph. So the theory is that you take like 12 things of the same shot and then you stack them together, and because noise is generated randomly, it cancels it out over the stacking of the layers in the computer. So I tried that method, and then some of them I literally would like take the image and blow it up on the computer in Photoshop and literally paint out every single pixel of noise, and it would take me 8 hours a day for 3 weeks straight for one image. So when the next sensor came out, I was like, I ran down to trade my camera in and get the new sensor. And that was drastically better, but then when I have the 5DS now, and that's even so much better.
And forgive me sticking with the technical here. As a film shooter, I found it really difficult to transition into any sort of long exposure with digital because the camera wants to cut you off.
Oh, you put it on, there's a mode where you have a remote control thing where you just lock the shutter open, and then I literally time it and then unlock it. And that's where I was saying I was using the reciprocity chart. So like in theory, if you're shooting for 2.5 minutes, reciprocity failure meant that the film would fail. And so you would have to expose it double the time in order to get it to be what it should be in theory. So if you're exposing it 2.5 minutes, reciprocity failure, you're gonna expose it at 5 minutes instead. If it's 20 minutes, 40 minutes. If it's 60 minutes, it's an hour or 2 hours. And some of the pictures were literally a long time, like 40, 45 minutes. I'm sitting there taking one photograph. So that's why when that woman walked into the shot, I was like, well, she's not going to show up there because she won't, unless she stands there for a long time, then we'd see her. But otherwise, you know, she's in and she's out, and the exposure was so long, you never saw her. So, does anybody else have any questions?
Jeanine, do you then enhance, I mean, you talked about painting the pixels with your first set, but do you then enhance the series in any way in Photoshop or anything?
For Through Darkness to Light, I literally am only trying to make the like information so that you see the lightest light still have details and the darkest dark still have details. And that's a lot of comments I get about these series for the prints. People are like, you can't see it. I'm like, that's the point. Like, you have to stand there and look at it for a while, excuse me, to have your eyes adjust so that you're in that darkness. And then you can see all the little details of the leaves and the trees and all of that stuff, so.
Was it your choice to shoot during those times?
The research drove that. And that's where I got the title again, Through Darkness to Light, because they would travel at night when it was safe. And so that's kind of why the series is taken all at night until the end, when they get to Canada and it's free and safe to move around during the daytime. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I noticed a lot of the work was 2016 and before. I just wonder, do you see the work that you do now or have done differently in the current political and educational environment that we're experiencing?
Completely. Yeah. I don't know if I would have started these projects now. It's an interesting, it's a whole gamut, and I've had so many conversations over it. I feel like the point of my work is to start conversations, and the conversations can become very uncomfortable very quickly. But I also feel like those conversations need to be started and sparked. So then I'm like, maybe I did need to do the work. So I don't know, I'm torn. I think that's a very, very good question. So yeah, I don't know, because yes, I am white, so I don't know if that, like I said, if I had done the Railroad series from the station master's perspective, I don't think it would have done the series justice. But again, I started it in 2002 before. But I also think, I think part of being an artist is very much about your own personal growth as a person. And I feel like I am a completely different person now because of what I've learned. And I feel like I've raised our son in a completely different manner than I would have if I hadn't gone through that process. So do I regret doing the work? No, but I don't know if I would go back, if I would choose to do it again, if that makes sense. Does anybody else have any questions?
Do you have a new idea?
Well, I am, I guess when I started the Cold War project that I mentioned that we're getting ready to do the Kickstarter campaign for the book for, I think the reason that I became interested in the Cold War is because my father was an atomic veteran. So he was stationed on the lead weather ship during the last battery of nuclear tests in the Pacific in 1962. And the United States crammed through this nuclear testing over 8 months in response to Russia doing so, because both countries were in talks over the nuclear test ban treaty that would be signed in 1963. So basically my dad's ship would sit on ground zero, and they would monitor the weather, which was that's what their purpose was. And then they would be told to move roughly between 18 and 30 miles away from ground zero to monitor the weather and the mushroom cloud and all of that. He was involved, he was pretty accurate. I had interviewed him for a VA claim, because there's a battery of illnesses that all these atomic veterans are getting. And so I think if the government had been more transparent with the fact that they were exposed to such high levels of radiation when he came down with prostate cancer, I think he would have opted not to do radiation treatment. And unfortunately he did. And that triggered, within a year and a half, he had 5 or 6 different cancers crop up. And the last one being multiple myeloma, which is like the key one that's on the compensation list. But I had interviewed him, and he was talking, he's like, it's my recollection that I was involved in 31 tests. There were 32. So he remembered pretty well. And they were, he never talked about it growing up, but there was they weren't allowed to until, I think they passed a law that in 1978 that said that they would be in trouble if they talked about it. And then 92, it was late 80s or 90s when that was repealed, and they're allowed to talk about it, but a lot of them don't know that they're allowed to talk about it now. And there's also a Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that would compensate them if they have any of the illnesses that hit that target list. But a lot of them don't know about the compensation to help them pay for their medical bills, and it's set to expire this July. So I'm hoping that some of the senators and House of Representatives, I know the New Mexico senator is on it because his constituents are downwinders from the Trinity tests on land. But yeah, so I want to kind of, when my dad died and I was going through all of his paperwork, like I found certificates from, it was called Operation Dominic. So if you guys are interested, you can Google it. And so he has like a certificate that says he was a participant, and there's like a mushroom cloud in the background from the United States Navy. And I'm like, this is just bizarre. And he had this like trifold, like even it's more than trifold, like 4 or 6 folded up card that like folded up to the size of a business card. And it was like atomic, biological, and chemical weapons, and they do, and what you should see and what you'll feel. And like 2 of them are an atomic bomb. And it's like talking about, you know, like there'll be a bright flash and you should find cover. And it's like, it's just ridiculous. So yeah, so I want to explore that, and then I want to interview atomic veterans because they're all getting old and they're not going to be with us much longer. So thank you.